First of all, I'll ask everyone to mute yourselves so we can start this second episode. I want also to thank everyone that joined this episode, and thank you for taking the time to register and allowing yourself to be here. Thank you also for everyone that shared in their social media and understanding this postponement of this section. My name is Ndivhuwo. I am a member of MWE. I am a chemical engineer, and I will start our second episode explaining what we are, Mozambique Women of Energy. MWE is a platform of women that allow them to work together and bring energy to identify areas of action and empowerment. We want to change the narrative of Mozambique, contributing to sustainable development of our country. We aim to increase the numbers of women in this sector, urban and rural areas, and we also want to highlight professional quality women in this sector, trying to create businesswomen opportunities for all women, but most important than anything, we are also working to make sure that everyone has access to energy. Equal access to energy is a huge objective of MWE. Most importantly, accessible, reliable, affordable, modern and clean energy for everyone. With that said, I want to thank Ndivhuwo for accepting this invitation and allowing herself to represent our network, that is the Mozambique Women of Energy. And also, I want to thank Simeon Kosa, that is a man who decided to join also our network, and he will be our moderator of today's webinar. I'll ask Simeon to turn his camera on, and I will let him do the rest, with starting with his introduction. For you guys, our audience, I want to remember all of you to mute yourself and be able to learn a lot with Ndivhuwo about reservoir characterization and reservoir engineer. I hope you guys enjoy this section.
Hi everyone, my name is Simeon Kosa. I'm an electronics engineer. I studied at the University of Nemakonde here in Mozambique, and currently I'm working for technical FMC as instrumentation and control systems engineer for the operations and maintenance of the Coral project. It's my pleasure to invite Ndivhuwo to talk about reservoir engineering. For those who have seen my LinkedIn page, I have asked some questions about reservoir engineering, and I hope that Ndivhuwo can answer all of these questions and we can all get motivated to understand better and have more people joining the energy industry. Thank you.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're all doing very well and that you and your families are keeping safe during these very difficult COVID times. I'm actually very honored to be speaking to you this afternoon. And I'd just like to extend a hand of gratitude to the Mozambique Women of Energy for inviting me to come and share with you a little bit of what I know on reservoir engineering and reservoir characterization. I really appreciate that you were able to take some time out of your day to come to listen to what I have to share with you. All right, so I hope that you will have a lot of takeaways and that you'll be able to understand a little bit better some aspects of the upstream oil and gas industry. So my presentation is just basically a continuation of what we had last month, where we had Antonio present to you on the LNG value chain, right? So as you noticed, there's different aspects to the LNG value chain. And what I'll be speaking to you about specifically today is on the upstream bit, which is the reservoir. And this is basically where the hydrocarbons come from before they are taken to the LNG facility for treatment and processing. So just a bit of introduction about myself. As Simao mentioned, my name is Nemakonde. and I'm a reservoir engineer, currently working for Schlumberger in South Africa. So for those of you who may not know who Schlumberger is, it is an oil field services company, right? And what we do is we provide world-class technology to oil and gas companies that are interested in looking for oil, in exploring oil, in extracting it, as well as, I guess producing it at the end of the day. So what I do specifically for Schlumberger is that I work in the software division. And my job is basically to support all our clients across sub-Saharan Africa to help them use our software, to help them basically get a better description of this reservoir that we're producing oil from, right? So I'm involved in a number of reservoir modeling studies, as well as reservoir simulation. So I hope that the knowledge that I've gained from my job, I'll be able to share with you as much as possible, and that you'll find this session very useful. So I do encourage you to ask any questions if at any point something is not clear. And I'll try as best as I can to help clarify and answer you. So with that, please allow me to share my screen with you, and I'll just turn my video off, right? Just so that we focus specifically on the presentation. And I'll turn it on again when we have our discussion. Yes, as I mentioned, I'm very excited to be sharing with you today, and the topic today is on reservoir characterization. So what I will do is just basically give you some basics, right, on what a reservoir is, the different features and the different characteristics of a reservoir, and basically why they are important to an oil and gas company. So I'll just start off by giving you an overview of what the oilfield lifecycle is. So this is just basically the different stages that oil and gas companies follow when they explore for hydrocarbons and produce it all the way till production and till they want to shut off the operations. I'll then give you an overview of what an oil and gas reservoir is. I'll speak to you about reservoir characterization, where I'll describe to you the different important characteristics of an oil and gas reservoir. I'll also explain to you the different data sources, right, or the different types of data that are collected and used to give us a better description or understanding of a reservoir. And I'll also just conclude by speaking to you a little bit on reservoir modeling. So the oilfield lifecycle, as I mentioned, basically refers to the different business stages that a company will go through, right, when they begin looking for oil and gas, right? So all of this starts with exploration, okay? And what happens in the exploration phase is that specialists or engineers or people who are actually experienced to do the job will go out looking for oil and gas, right, to understand if maybe a particular region has oil and gas reservoirs in the subsurface. So what happens here is that they'll study geological outcrops on the surface because, right, obviously the rocks that we have on land give us a clue in terms of what the subsurface would look like, right? So using that as clues, they're able to get an idea regarding that. So what also happens here is that seismic will be shot into the ground. So if exploration is on land, then what they'll do is they'll use trucks. And if it's in the water or if it's offshore, then seismic will be shot or performed using ships. So if it is found that a particular area may potentially have oil and gas, right? The project then moves on to the appraisal phase, right? And in the appraisal phase, they drill what is known as appraisal wells or delineation wells, which basically help a company understand how big or the extent of the reservoir. And then using this information, they're able to calculate the amount of oil and gas that is available under the ground, right? And during this time, various members of the team will be performing studies to understand if this oil that is discovered is actually possible to produce in a profitable manner, right? Because it's pointless to actually have oil and not be able to make profit from it, right? So we want to understand that the oil that is available can be produced profitably. So if it is established that the oil that is discovered can be produced economically, then the project will move to the development phase, right? So at this point, the planning and execution of the project starts, right? So infrastructure will be developed, people will be mobilized to drill wells, to put up surface facilities, right, where this oil will be stored or this gas will be stored once it's produced. And roads will also be developed, right, because we want to be able to transport this fuel from one point to another, I mean, from the oil field to the refinery or to the end user, right? So this phase could take about 4 to 10 years. And after the wells are drilled, then they move to the production phase or production stage. And at this point, the first oil and gas will be produced by the oil and gas company, and then they'll begin to make profit, right, from the sales of these hydrocarbons. So this process can actually continue for a period of somewhere between 15 to 50 years, depending on the size of the oil field. So if the oil field is very big, it means that they may potentially have a lot of oil, which may take a longer time or a longer amount of time to produce. So after it is no longer profitable, right, to extract oil from under the ground, right? Because remember, at the end of the day, there are going to be expenses. There's going to be costs, right? You want to be able to maintain your facilities. So if this oil that you're producing doesn't allow you to make profit anymore or to cover those costs in a way that the company wants, then the project will move on to the abandonment phase or decommissioning. And this is where all the wells will be shut in, the infrastructure will be removed, and the area where production is taking place will be rehabilitated, right? So since we're speaking about reservoir characterization, right, what exactly is a reservoir, right? What exactly is an oil and gas reservoir? So to put it out to you simply, an oil and gas reservoir is basically a subsurface accumulation of hydrocarbons, right? So hydrocarbons are basically the chemical compounds which make up oil and gas, right? So if you have hydrocarbons that are very short, then they'll represent the gas. So we're speaking about methane, right? And then if you have hydrocarbons which have slightly longer chains, then that will represent your oil phase, right? And the longer the hydrocarbon, the heavier the oil. So where does this oil come from, or where does this hydrocarbon that is contained in the reservoir come from? So over many millions of years, what happens is marine plant and animal matter dies, right? And then it sinks all the way down to the bottom of the ocean. And as it sinks, it will be buried by sediments, right? So it could be fine. It's typically fine because the ocean is a low energy environment. So as time goes by, more and more sediments will be buried on that organic matter. And the organic matter will now begin to transform, because the more layers we have burying the hydrocarbons, the hotter it will become and the more pressure there will be. So it will begin cooking these microorganisms and it will transform to either gas or oil, depending on the depth of the burial, right? So the deeper you go, because it's going to be hotter, gas will be produced, and the higher up in the source rock, you will have oil. So as your source rock continues to mature, your oil and gas will begin to be expelled from the source rock. This is the kitchen where the cooking happens, right? So because there's going to be a lot of pressure on the source rock from the rocks that are above it, it's basically going to squeeze out this oil and gas, and it's going to migrate all the way up the layers of rock until it hits a layer of rock that is not permeable, and that is known as a cap rock, right? So this will then result in the formation of an accumulation of the oil and gas, and this is now known as the reservoir, right? So for a reservoir to form, it's important that we have a cap rock, we need to have a source rock, and we need to have a seal, right? All the way around the reservoir to prevent the oil and gas from escaping. So for us to actually understand this reservoir, right, its characters, its description, right, because after all, it's under the ground and nobody really knows what it looks like. And before an oil and gas company drills, they need to know exactly what they're getting themselves into, because drilling is very expensive. And you don't want to drill in an area where it is not profitable to produce. So what we now need to do is characterize the reservoir, right? So what does characterization mean anyways, right? So characterization is basically the process of describing the main features of an object of interest, right? So if, for example, I were to define to you or to describe to you the characteristics of my best friend, right? I'll tell you that, okay, she's very tall, she's slim, she's got dark skin, she's got big eyes, right? So you see, the more information I give to you regarding her description, the better you understand what she looks like, right? And the same applies to the reservoir. So characterizing the reservoir basically involves collecting and obtaining data from different sources, putting this information together, and then having an understanding of exactly what this reservoir is, right? I like to describe an oil and gas reservoir as the human body, right? Because after all, the human body has different components and they have different functions as well, and they're understood by different doctors. So if I were to liken this to an oil and gas reservoir, your skeleton, for example, is what gives your body your shape or your structure. It's what helps you to stand up or keep up or walk, right? So it gives you your shape. And this is basically what geophysicists do. So the purpose of a geophysicist is to describe the structure of the reservoir, right? That container. So the human body also has muscle, right? So if you have a skeleton, it has to have meat attached to it, right? And this is basically the job of a geologist and petrophysicist. So what they do is they basically try to understand the characteristics that are contained in that reservoir, the characteristics of the rock, right? And this is basically similar to the muscle that you'd have on your body. So the last piece of the puzzle is your blood system, right? Your circulatory system. And this is where flow occurs in your body. I mean, we know that your blood flows from your head to your toes, and it circulates nutrients and food and oxygen to the different parts of your body that may need it. So in the sense of the reservoir, this would represent the job of an engineer, a reservoir engineer. So their job is to basically understand the fluid, right, the blood, and basically how it moves inside the reservoir. And the importance of that is that it basically helps us understand how much you can produce, right? If you understand how your fluid will move inside a system, then you know if it will be easy or not to produce and how quickly that will be possible. So what is the purpose of reservoir characterization, right? So what are we trying to achieve from doing this? So the first bit of information that we get from characterizing a reservoir, getting a description, understanding it, is that we're able to understand how much oil or gas is contained, right? What the volume is, because you have an idea of the structure of the reservoir, right? The second thing that we get from this is understand the best way to produce it, right? And how we produce from a reservoir is by drilling wells, right? We drill different types of wells. We could drill one well, you could drill multiple wells, depending on the size of your reservoir and what your production target is. So understanding your reservoir helps you understand how best to develop it, right? You'll need to inject water to maintain pressure. So all of this is important at this point. And then lastly, characterizing your reservoir also helps you understand how much you'll be able to produce at the end of the day. What is your recovery, right? Because you could have oil inside your reservoir, but the question is, will you be able to extract all of it, right? So you want to understand how much you will be able to produce from your reservoir. And this is basically what reservoir characterization helps us to achieve. So in characterizing our reservoir, one of the most important geological information that we can obtain, again, is the structure, right? The shape of your reservoir. Basically, what is the top, what is the extent, what is the bottom, right? We want to understand what that container is that contains or that holds your oil and gas. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, when describing to you what an oil and gas reservoir is, so your oil and gas will actually migrate all the way up until it is trapped by something, or it hits a rock or a structure that is not permeable, right? So if there's no such rock in place, then migration will continue until your oil and gas will go to the surface, right? So the structure in which your hydrocarbons are basically contained, this reservoir, is called a trap, right? Because essentially what happens is that over millions and millions of years, your layers will be, your rocks will be deposited in the form of different grains of sediments, right? Or sand or rock. And this will cause layers. But due to plate tectonics or due to erosion or weathering, what happens is the shape or structure of those layers will change, right? And understanding the kind of trap that you have basically helps you understand the kind of reservoir that you have. So examples of traps would be your fault. So this is caused, for example, if you have movement in your reservoir rock or plate tectonics. And this would let some of your rocks move lower and some higher, right? And because you're going to have some rocks that are not permeable, aligning with rocks that are permeable, then it's basically going to trap your oil and gas for you. And the same also applies with an anticline, right? So what happens here is that you have compression in your rocks, and then it forces your rocks to fold, and then that fold basically encloses your reservoir. So we basically want to understand what the trap is, because it helps us to understand the container and the geometry, right? And the volumes that are enclosed, that your reservoir is contained within. So we also have stratigraphic traps, which happen when maybe erosion takes place, or weathering, or diagenesis. So basically your rock changes, and maybe a different type of sand then gets deposited on it, right? So because there's a difference between the properties of the permeability of these two rocks, then that will form as some sort of trap, right? And that basically is where your reservoir will be formed. So once you've established the external geometry of the reservoir, the next thing we want to understand is the internal reservoir infrastructure, right? Because all the geometry tells us is how big, how wide, and where the extents are. So in understanding the internal architecture, we basically understand how the rocks or how the layers of rocks are distributed within the reservoir, right? So as you can imagine, a reservoir is not homogeneous, right? So meaning that each layer is not the same, right? It will have different properties. Each rock will be different. The very same way that if you go out and walk on the street, you'll be able to see that there's different sands everywhere and there's different types of rocks. And the same thing applies to the reservoir. And the reason why it's important is because it affects the quality of your reservoir, right? So for us to understand the behavior of, to properly predict the behavior of your reservoir when you begin to produce, you want to know the quality, because some rocks may basically be barriers to flow, meaning that they'll prevent your oil and gas from flowing because they're not permeable, and some may be good, right? So we want to be able to have an understanding of how these rocks are arranged inside the reservoir. And how geologists do this is by basically understanding the original environment in which your sediments were deposited, right? Your reservoir rocks were deposited, and these could be different. So it could be marine, it could be on land, it could be a transitional environment. So understanding this basically helps you better describe the rock groups that will be situated close together in the reservoir, and will be able to give their properties accurately, right? So vertically, how it's done is by using what we call stratigraphy, right? So based on the ages of rocks, because I mean, you know that the world is very old, and each era has a particular sequence of deposition, right? So essentially what geologists will do is they'll use this vertical profile to understand at which point which layer is, And then this will help us understand the lateral distribution, right, in the horizontal direction. So once the rocks have been distributed, or once the rocks or the meat, right, the muscle has been added to this trap or the geometry of your reservoir, what happens is you need to determine or to define the quality of the rock. So what I mean by quality is that you want to know the storage capacity of your rock, right? You want to know how much hydrocarbons it's able to contain, right? And you also want to know whether or not that rock will allow for your hydrocarbons to move freely, right? So these qualities are basically termed porosity and permeability. So if a rock has high porosity, it means that it has very big pores between the grains of sand, right? Because, I mean, rocks are made by tiny grains of sand. I mean, it may look solid to the human eye, but then if you look at it under the microscope, you'll notice that there's little void spaces. And this is basically where your oil is stored. So we want to understand what the storage capacity of your reservoir is. So these pore spaces can be connected, right? Depending on how tightly your grains are sorted, right? And this is what allows your fluid to flow from one point of the reservoir to another. And this can be described as permeability, right? So the more permeable your reservoir is, it means the easier it is for it to produce or to be drained. So these are the two most important qualities that can be assigned to rock, right? And this is what will characterize or basically define whether or not the rock that you have is a good reservoir. So the most common reservoir rocks are typically sedimentary rocks, right? So these are formed when small grains or particles cement to each other, and then they form a rock, right? And then as they cement, those little cementation spaces give capacity to the rock, and they also contribute to the flow. So these are the most important characters. So it's important to note that you might have a rock that has good porosity, but not very good permeability. And that is not good, right? Because as much as you're able to contain a lot of hydrocarbons, you want to be able to produce them at the end of the day. So this is why we need to understand these rocks so that we know exactly where to drill, right, and produce economically or as required by the oil and gas company. So in characterizing the reservoir, what we also want to understand is the relationship between your reservoir rock and your fluid, right? Because remember, your fluid is basically stored inside the pore spaces, right? So it's always in connection or in interaction with the rock, right? And depending on the saturation, basically the amount of each fluid, as well as its relative permeability, as well as its portability, then that will affect how easily it is for each fluid to flow. But I'll just take you quickly through each of these terms. So initially, before your hydrocarbons move to your reservoir, right, what happens is that your reservoir rock is filled with water, right? So as your hydrocarbons are expelled from the source rock and migration takes place, your hydrocarbons will now flow all the way up to the reservoir, and then they'll begin to displace or to take up the space of the water that was initially in the pore space. So now it means that you're going to have multiple phases, right? You're going to have oil, you're going to have water or gas, depending on the fluids that are available. So this basically is important for us because when calculating the amount of fluids you have in place, you want to be able to not include the volumes of water, right? You only want to consider the hydrocarbons. So knowing the saturation of each is important because it means you can subtract from the overall volume and have the correct quantities. So another important quality that one needs to understand is the relative permeability, right? And this is just basically the ability of one fluid to flow in the presence of another. I mean, imagine you had a system where you had water and a different fluid. So water won't flow the same way it would have flowed if it were by itself, right, in that system. Because if you now add another fluid, there'll be competition between which fluid will flow the quickest, right? And obviously this will hinder the individual flow capacity of each. So we need to understand this because at different saturations, it may be easier to flow oil or to flow water, right? So the reservoir engineer wants to understand this before they can, implement a development plan. So the last property is the rock wettability. And essentially what this means is that it's the ability of a rock to maintain contact with a fluid or vice versa. So if you have a rock that wants to cling onto oil, that is called an oil wet rock. And essentially that is not what we want, right? Because if a rock clings onto oil, it means that the oil will be more difficult to drain from your reservoir, right? So why this is important is that if engineers decide to, let's say, implement a secondary recovery mechanism, right? Let's say you want to now, let's say you want to extract this oil. You want to understand the kind of rock it is. Let me think of an example. So if you, let's say, had oil on your hand, right? So if you wipe it off using a cloth or your shirt, it may be very difficult for you to remove it, right? Because it sticks on. Like you may need a chemical to remove it, and that chemical is of course soap. So if you use soap, then it will strip off that oil completely from your hand, right? And you'll be able to wash it off. And the same concept also applies to your reservoir rocks. So if you inject chemicals, certain chemicals are able to actually strip off that oil, and then you'll be able to produce all of that oil, or to increase the recovery of the oil that you're producing. So that's why it's important to understand this characteristic. So of course, I can't speak of reservoir characterization and not mention our fluids, right? Because I mean, this is what makes us the money. This is what oil and gas companies sell to make money, right? So it is therefore important to understand which fluids we have in the reservoir, as well as their behavior, right? Because under different conditions, your fluid will have a particular behavior, okay? I'll get to that just shortly. So as I mentioned, you can have different distributions of oil in your reservoir. You can have oil, water, gas, or you can have just two phases or one phase, right? And the reservoir oil and gas can be further characterized into different groups, right? And even just by looking at the oil, you can see that it has different characteristics, right? So a heavier oil, which is more dense, which is more viscous, which is more difficult to flow, will have a darker color. And an oil which is lighter and has a nicer, sweeter smell will have a light color, right? So you want to understand this because different oils will sell for different prices, right? So you want to be able to understand what kind of oil you have at the end of the day. So another reason why it's important is because, as I mentioned, your properties change with different conditions. Because in your reservoir, your pressure is high and you have, let's say, high temperature. So when you start producing and your oil moves from your reservoir to your surface, right, your pressure begins to decrease, meaning that the volume will change, right? And the way in which the fluid flows will also be different. So we want to be able to understand that. So all of this is studied in the lab, and that information can be used then in reservoir modeling to better describe the fluid. So once we have information of the structure of the reservoir, and we also have an understanding of what fluids we have and their properties, as well as the description of the reservoir quality, that is porosity, what we can then do is proceed to estimate the amount of oil and gas that is available in the reservoir, right? The easiest way to do this is actually using volumetric methods. I mean, you know that you can calculate the volume of something using the area multiplied by the height, right? So the same concept applies to your reservoir. So in the reservoir, we have what we call fluid contacts, right? So between each fluid, there will be a particular contact, and that basically gives you an idea of the height of each fluid in the reservoir. And using that information, we're able to then calculate the volumes of fluid you have. So because gas tends to occupy a bigger volume, or it tends to be big, right, in quantity compared to oil, we usually use million standard cubic feet to to describe it, right? And cubic feet standard just means that we're using temperature conditions to, we're talking about the volume at standard conditions, and standard conditions is at your surface. So this will be your surface volume of oil, and then of gas, sorry. And then when we speak of the oil volumes, then we refer to them in 1,000 stock tank barrels. And again, this is a surface quantity, right? So we need to also understand how the volumes will change from the reservoir to the surface. And for us to do that, we need to know what the fluid property is that is known as formation volume factor. Because, for example, if you think of a can of Coke, right? Your can of Coke is, of course, in a liquid phase, but then you know that we have gas dissolved in it. So if I open the can of Coke, what happens is the gas will be liberated, right? So the gas will escape, right? And the same thing also applies to the reservoir. So when you produce, we'll have some gas escaping from the oil phase, and that will, of course, affect the volume of the oil. So we want to be able to understand how that will also happen from our reservoir to the surface. So what we also want to understand in characterizing the reservoir is the energy that drives production inside the reservoir, right? Because essentially what this helps us to understand is the recovery of your oil or your gas, right? How much will you be able to recover naturally, right? Or using the primary energy of the reservoir. So there's quite a number of drive mechanisms. So this basically means what source, as I mentioned, what source the reservoir will get the energy from. So in the first case, I have water drive or aquifer drive, right? So as you saw in the previous pictures that I showed, normally you have water underneath your oil face in the reservoir, right? So if you produce your reservoir, if you remove oil, it means that you're leaving a volume, right? There's going to be a void because you've removed something from it. So now if you have a strong water drive, your water will move upwards, right? From an aquifer, your water could potentially be connected to a water body, right? And then as you produce, then the water will move upwards to displace the oil that you've produced. And in doing so, it gives pressure support to your reservoir. So you're able to produce, so if I could just recap a little bit. So your reservoir is always under pressure, right? Or will be under pressure. And the pressure between your reservoir and your surface will be different, right? As well as between the interface of your well bore. So what happens is when you drill the well, it will create a pressure differential. And then automatically, because the pressure in the reservoir is higher, then you're able to flow your well naturally. So obviously, as pressure drops, it means that you're not going to be able to produce as much because it means that the potential difference is becoming less and less. So what you'll need is an additional support, right? So in this particular case, the support is natural and it will come from your water, right? Which is coming in from underneath your reservoir, right? And then as you begin to produce, your water level will go all the way up. And sometimes it could happen that you would start producing that water, right? So the water would need to be separated from your oil in the surface. So another kind of drive mechanism or energy that we have is what we call your gas cap drive. So if you have a reservoir that is, say, saturated, right? Meaning that you cannot dissolve any more gas inside the oil. What happens is you're going to have a gas forming on top of the oil, right? And then this gas is basically what gives energy to the production of your oil because it will add pressure to the oil and then it will cause that oil to be produced all the way up your well bore. So this is an example of a gas cap drive reservoir. So in some instances, you may have a solution gas drive, right? So your reservoir will start off with just one phase, which is oil, for example. And then as you produce oil, because you're removing, then it means that you're removing and you're reducing the pressure. So based on the phase behavior, it means that you will at some point reach what we call the bubble point pressure. And at bubble point, you're going to have bubbles of gas coming out of your oil, right? So as these bubbles of gas begin to form in your reservoir, these give energy. So they push the oil to be produced, right, towards your wellbore. And the more you produce and the more the pressure drops, the bubbles become bigger and bigger, and until they begin to connect, right? And then they stop giving the energy to the oil. So this kind of drive is called a solution gas drive. So the oil gets energy from the gas bubbles, which are growing and growing and increasing in size. So sometimes you might have a reservoir that has multiple drive mechanisms, right? Like in this example that I have, we have a reservoir that's getting energy from water, and we have a reservoir that's getting energy from gas, right? So it is possible that you may have multiple drive mechanisms in place, and that of course will affect the ultimate recovery of your reservoir, right? The amount of hydrocarbons you can produce fully at the end of the day. So where does this information that we use to describe or to understand the properties of our reservoir come from? So the first bit of information, I mean, this is the quickest or easiest to find, and it's basically studying outcrops, right? So on land, you're able to study the characteristics of the rocks that you see. And this will basically give you information regarding what's happening in the ground, right? Because this rock, of course, continues into the subsurface. So understanding the properties of this rock will give us information regarding, whether or not, I mean, there could potentially be oil, but you would need to use other information with that, right? You can't just use one piece of information alone, because the more data you use, the more certain you are, and the better the description becomes, the more clearer the description becomes. So another source of data is from seismic, right? So as I had mentioned previously, oil and gas companies, when they begin to explore for oil and gas, they can send out ships, they can send out trucks if you're exploring on land. And what these ships do is they'll send out signals, right, into the subsurface, right? And then the different layers of rock will then give a reflection regarding, their depths. And this will be received by hydrophones, right? And then what happens is it will be used to create what we call a seismic section, for example. And then based on that, we're able to see where the different layers are in the reservoir and what their structures are. So from this information, you're also able to see the kind of traps that you have. Do you have a fault? Do you have an anticline? And then that is the kind of information that points to whether or not you could potentially have a reservoir, and helps companies to move from appraisal from exploration to appraisal. So another source of information is your well log, right? So essentially what happens is that during drilling, a tool will be lowered into your well, right? And then a signal will be shot into your formation or into the rocks alongside your well. And the response of that will basically give us information regarding the kind of rock that you have. So if you're going to have a sandstone, if you're going to have shale, if you're going to have a tight rock, for example, that is going to give you a particular signal, right? If you're going to have water, or if you're going to have gas or oil at a particular depth, then you'll be able to see it from the signal, right? And this information can help us understand the kind of rocks we have at different depths, as well as their properties. And it will also help us understand where the different fluid contacts are within our reservoir. So another kind or piece of data that we can use is called core data, right? So core data is just basically a cylinder of rock that is extracted from the side of your oil and gas well, right? So using that information, you're able to actually understand physically, right? The kind of rock that you have. You're also able to understand the fluid saturations, right? Because as I mentioned, your fluid is situated inside the rock. So you're able to understand how much oil there is in that rock, or how much oil or gas it can contain. And then in addition to that, for further analysis, you can take additional samples from this core, right? This core plug, and then this can be studied further in the laboratory to understand what the relative permeabilities of your rock are, right? So your rock and your fluids, right? So it helps you understand how easily it is for different saturations of fluid to flow within that rock. So what we can also use to understand the behavior of our reservoir, right, is production data. So after you've drilled your wells and you are producing from your reservoir, right, your production data basically helps you understand the continuity of your reservoir, right? So the good thing about this is that it actually covers a bigger area compared to your logs or your cores, for example, because they give you information only about what's happening in the region of your wellbore. But then with production data, because flow is coming from one side of the reservoir to the other, you're able to understand or to basically get an understanding of whether or not there could be barriers at some point in your reservoir. Do you have good productivity, for example? So using that information, you're able to add that to the piece of the puzzle, right? To better understand the distribution of your rocks between your well, right? As described by the information that you've received from your logs in your core. So another way to also get information regarding your reservoir is through formation testing. So what basically happens here is that, or what the kind of information you can get on here is your fluids. So you can have a device that goes into the wellbore and then it's able to extract your fluids, right, for you, which can be taken to the lab for analysis. And also during well testing, we are also able to understand the initial reservoir pressure, right, or the pressure characteristics, the pressure of your reservoir, as well as what the permeability could be, right? And all of that can be used in addition with everything else to add more and more to the description of your reservoir. So how is this information used, right? So essentially what you can do with all this data that you've collected, you can create a numerical representation of your reservoir, right? And this is known as a reservoir model. So reservoir models can either be static or they can be dynamic, right? And the good thing about using a reservoir is that, a model to basically understand the characteristics of your field, the behavior of your reservoir, is that you're able to drill as many wells as you want in this model and to simulate how you will produce, how, for example, pressure will drop in your reservoir, how the different features of your rock will affect production. Or else you can't do that in real life because it's very expensive, right? You can't go around drilling 100 wells hoping that you will drill in a place where you'll be able to produce a lot of oil. Right, so in creating the reservoir model, you're able to perform studies which basically help you understand how best to develop your field, right? So it gives you information regarding how many wells you may need to drill, where you may need to complete your wells, right? So completing, like perforating, right, which is where your oil will flow into your well. It gives you information regarding, the orientation of your wells. Should your wells be vertical? Should they be deviated? Should they be horizontal? Would I need to inject in my reservoir in order to maintain pressure, right? So your reservoir model basically helps you to do that, right? So the first stage, as I mentioned, is that we need to use data that is extracted, right, from various sources. And this data is handled by different people in the team, right? So a geophysicist will use the seismic to understand where the different layer tops or where the different layers start and end, right, in your reservoir. And then what they do is they'll also create a structural model of that using information on faults as well, because these show you the different compartments of your reservoir or the different areas where there may be barriers to flow. So if you drill a well here, you may not be able to produce from this area because there's a barrier, right? So all of this is created by geoscientists. And then what they also do is that they are able to distribute your properties, right? They're able to distribute the porosity and the permeability and assign it to the different rock types that we have. And then all of this will result in a geological model, which can then be given to the reservoir engineer, right, who populate information regarding the fluid that they've analyzed, regarding the rock, regarding the fluid rock properties, your relative permeability, your saturations as well, which come from the petrophysicists, right? And after that, once we have the drilling information from the driller, we can now add the wells in the reservoir, right? And then at different rates, as they're producing in different pressures, we're able to simulate how flow will occur in the reservoir, right? And from that, we're able to see all the different profiles, right? So if, for example, you wanted to understand how your well will produce over a period of time, then you're able to get that information from your simulation model or from your reservoir simulator, right? So another very important thing is that as you produce, right, because as it is, the data that you have, that you're collecting, I mean, it's not from everywhere in your reservoir, right? It's just from areas where you have your well bore. So there's still a lot of uncertainty because you don't know what's happening between the wells. So what happens is using information that you have on the flow of your wells, this dynamic information, you're able to perform a history match, which basically allows you to match the behavior of your model to the behavior of the performance of the field as it's happening in reality, right? So essentially what we'll then do is use that information to improve the characteristics of the geo model, right? So obviously if you're producing more than you expected in reality, then it could mean that your reservoir in reality has good permeability in particular areas. So then you're going to go back to your model and then you're going to maybe make the layers more permeable, right? So that as your model simulates, it's able to show an increased production to match what is happening in the field. So this is basically the importance of reservoir modeling, right? So it saves us a lot of money. It saves us from making mistakes because using this information, we're basically able to understand how to best develop the field without actually going to do it out in real life. So why would we need a reservoir model? So the first thing is that you'd be able to estimate your hydrocarbons in place because you saw that your model defines the structure, it has your porosity, you have different saturations as well. So using that, you're able to understand how much oil and gas can be contained because you also know where your different fluid contacts are, right? So you know the individual volumes of the different fluids. So as I mentioned, you're also able to select the best development strategy, right? Will I need just one well? Will I need two wells? Will I need to inject water to maintain pressure? So all of that can be obtained from your model, right? So later on, after your reservoir has been producing, right, it could be that there's some areas that have oil that hasn't been produced yet or that hasn't been drained. So this also helps you to identify where those areas are. And then you can also go on and improve recovery by drilling wells in those areas so that you can maximize the production of oil in that area, right? And what this also does, it helps you to optimize your final recovery, right? Because in selecting your best development strategy and knowing where to drain your reservoir further, it means that you're able to extract as much hydrocarbons as you need, right? So it will help you understand what your final recovery is, or basically your reserves. And lastly, it helps us identify and quantify subsurface uncertainties because after all, like I mentioned, your reservoir is in the subsurface. We don't see it. A lot of things will therefore be uncertain because we're only using data that is obtained at one point, right? Or few points. And that is at your well bore, right? And using that, we try to help ourselves understand what is happening elsewhere in the reservoir. So that introduces a lot of uncertainty, right? So a reservoir model basically helps us to understand how your field will perform under these different uncertainties. And this will basically help you understand the risks associated with the way you're developing your field and how you can mitigate them. So yes, so this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that you found this presentation useful, and that you were just able to also add and increase to the knowledge that you have on reservoir characterization or reservoir engineering. So with that, I'll open up the floor.
Amazing. Thank you for the presentation.
Oh, Samir, I'm so sorry. I can't hear you clearly. Your voice is very, very faint.
As I was saying, Ndivhuwo, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting, very technical also. And can you hear me?
I can hear you, but very faintly. But you can continue.
Okay. So, yeah. My experience, I understand that drilling is really a very slow process. It can take 1 hour with conventional drilling to drill a 1 meter borehole. So I think the job is very important, and the people who joined the presentation should have learned a lot from it. We have some questions from the audience here, and the first one would be, was it very difficult for you as a woman to enter the industry? Yes, I was asking if it was difficult for you as a woman to enter this industry.
Oh, it was difficult for me as a woman to enter this industry. Oh, thank you very much. So the answer is no. It wasn't difficult for me as a woman. I mean, first of all, what companies look for when they employ people, right, is your capabilities and your skills, right? And the way to get that is by being educated, right? So for me, what I did is I made sure that I had the right skills for my job. So I researched, because I knew that I wanted to be in engineering, right? So what would I need as a woman to be an engineer, right? So I know that I had to study subjects which relate to my job. So I went and did maths and science in high school. In university, I went and did engineering, right? So being equipped in that manner makes me fit to work, right? Whether I'm a woman or a man, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is using your skills and you're using your brain and your knowledge to do your job. So in short, I wouldn't say it was difficult for me. And another reason that made it very easy for me is because, I mean, I had role models, which were engineers as well. So me seeing them do what they were doing as engineers also encouraged me and motivated me and showed me that I too can do what they're doing, right? So if they can do it, so can I. And I mean, to give you to cut the answer short, it wasn't difficult for me as a woman to go into engineering, because I think it's open for everyone, although society has stereotypes attached to it. It wasn't difficult at all, because I proved myself and I proved that I'm capable of doing my job. So thank you for the question.
Thank you for your answer. I think that was pretty straightforward, and it's encouraging that you don't see yourself in a position that you have been undermined, or you feel like, okay, I'm a woman and I'm joining this industry, so you feel like I'm an engineer and I'm going to work.
Exactly. Exactly. The job is not tied to my gender at the end of the day. You know what I'm saying? I saw myself as a person who was capable to do the job. I'm an engineer, okay? So that is what counts. And that is, I mean, what employers should see, right? The fact that you're able and you have the right skills to do what you need to do, and that you're actually passionate about your job.
Thank you.
I think that's what helped me.
Yeah. Another question from May. I hope I'm reading the name perfectly. So May is, first of all, congratulating you for the presentation. And she would like to know what were your biggest challenges when you were working and in a very important segment of the energy industry? For sure, she's also asking if sometimes you feel that it was difficult as not always the abilities of women are recognized.
Okay, so thank you so much for your question. I hope I actually understood it correctly. So the first question was, what are my challenges as a woman in the industry? Is that what it is?
Yes.
Okay, so I know that we hear a lot about challenges, but for me, I think my story is different because I think there's more silver linings than challenges. I feel that I've received so much support, right? And I've also had, like I said, role models, right? So where this started off, first of all, is in university, right? Because, I mean, we all know that engineering is a male-dominated industry. So in seeing that the majority of my classmates were actually women, right? So that gave me a lot of confidence, right? In knowing that, look, I can do this and I'm in the right place. And when I also started working, I found myself in a company that actually prioritizes and cares about diversity, right? Because as you work for an oil and gas industry, most of them are international and they do care about diversity because we have different from all over the place. So I found that my company took that very seriously. And I mean, gender is also diversity, right? Because you know what I'm saying? Like it's how you classify people. So I found that I didn't get a lot of challenges because my company really did help quite a lot. I worked in a team of people who were very, very supportive. And funny enough, I'm actually one of the few women in my team. And somebody actually pointed it out for me to realize it. And this goes to show you that I've had it quite easy, right? I've been in a place where people believe in me, people support me, and people help me. So I'd say for my company specifically, I haven't really had challenges. But where I see challenges is when you work with clients, for example, right? Because like I said, the industry has a lot of different cultures, right? So if you have a lot of different cultures, it means that people are going to have different mindsets and some people may have a particular stereotype. So what I found is that in some cases, they do look at you, of course, as a woman and especially as a young woman and wonder if you're able to help them out. So you find that you're considered inferior, right? And what you have to then do is that you have to work very hard to prove yourself. And only until they realize what you're able to show them, right? Then they begin to respect you. So I'd say in summary that my biggest challenge is that people don't believe you or don't believe that you have the capabilities because once again, the stereotype comes in to label you as somebody who doesn't know what you're doing as a woman in engineering. So yeah, that for me was my biggest challenge, proving that I'm actually capable of doing the job, not in my company, but with people who I tend to work with. And it's due to cultural mindsets.
Thank you. That's a very good answer. I hope that the person who asked the question feels more confident to join the industry and knows that there are many companies who support us and not only women, but everybody, even young men, young women, we all need this type of support to grow. And we also need the acceptance from the clients, from all the parties, so that these young people can feel confident and they can perform at their best. I have technical questions from Fania Matabel. I think she's willing to be a reservoir engineer or she's a reservoir engineer already. She's asking when the permeability of a reservoir is not good, some technologies are used to allow fracturing in order to facilitate the permeability and consequently the extraction of hydrocarbons from the subsurface of the surface. What are the most serious implications of fracturing?
Okay, thank you so much for your question. So In cases where you have low permeabilities, of course, I mean, you'd need to enhance the permeability, right, by fracturing. And that would mean that you'd have to use fracture fluids, right? So chemicals which are foreign to the reservoir. And in some instances, what may happen is that when you fracture, you may affect the geomechanics of the rock, right? So if you fracture, you may fracture too hard that you may frack such that it allows for your hydrocarbons to flow way past your reservoir is. So in this particular instance, if you frack beyond the pressure, your maximum reservoir pressure, right, or the maximum rock pressure, what happens is you have hydrocarbons or your shale gas or your frack gas escaping beyond where your reservoir is to higher up in your reservoir, right? So it will migrate up to potentially where your water is that people drink, right? So, I mean, for me, I think that is one of the things that need to be taken into consideration when fracturing, right? The fact that like we can fracture too hard or at very high pressures that will create permeability conduits way beyond your reservoir, leading up to where water is that is consumed by people. So that is one of the most dangerous things that fracking operations can do.
Okay, so we expect that fracturing is done only by professionals.
Pardon?
We expect that fracturing is only done by professionals so that we have clean water to drink. Vanya has one more question, and that is to say that four-dimensional seismic is a demonstration of the technological evolution caused by the need to increase the efficiency of seismic research. She would like to know if the existence of 4D seismic with the existence of 4D seismic, the usefulness of 3D seismic is cancelled, or both are used, or depends on the complexity of the acquisition of data from the reservoirs.
I'm so sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Yes, with the new technology, which is 4D seismic, is seismic still useful or not? And if it is still useful, can you use both? Or it depends on the complexity of the acquisition of the data from the reservoirs.
Okay, to be honest with you, I do not have a lot of experience with seismic, right? But I mean, for me, if that means that that will allow you to get more data, right, from your reservoir, right, extract more information regarding the state of your reservoir, I mean, I think it's something that can be done, right? Because I mean, the more data you have, the better, because you're able to better characterize your reservoir and understand its properties. But I personally do not have a lot of experience with seismic at all, so I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, except that if you're able to get more data in a costly manner, then why not, if it's going to help you have a better understanding of your reservoir?
Okay, thank you. I hope she's happy with the answer, and maybe you can answer the questions in next episodes of the.
Exactly. And I mean, if not, then I mean, she can feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be able to get more information that I'll share with her.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So I have Pash Magwaza. There is any other way to increase the pressure on a reservoir when you have the pressure of the pressure besides using injected fluid?
Oh, thank you. So the question is there any other way to increase the reservoir pressure besides injecting fluids?
Yes.
Okay, to answer the question, it's not possible to do so. I mean, the only way to increase the pressure is without injecting the fluids is if you were to use the natural fluids that are already contained in the subsurface, right? So in this particular case, it would be an aquifer, right, which should be there already. And there should be a strong aquifer drive, right, for that to happen. So the pressure will be maintained automatically and naturally. But apart from adding any additional fluids to your reservoir, then there is no way, right? Because essentially what pressure maintenance is that you are replacing the volumes that we withdrawn, right? Yeah, so if you're not able to replace those volumes by injecting, then there has to be a strong aquifer drive or strong water encroachment that goes into your reservoir. So to answer the question, it is not possible to do so. You'd need to introduce a foreign substance into your reservoir, which will either be water being injected or gas being injected into your gas cap.
Thank you. We have a question from Lady Carvalho, and the question is: in your point of view, what you see at the field, where do you think the environmental engineering could be more useful?
So the question is, where do I think engineering, environmental engineering will be useful?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I think it is usually useful in the exploration phase, right? Because before, in the appraisal phase, sorry, because before you begin to decide on whether or not you want to drill, you have to do an environmental impact assessment to see how the developments that you're going to be having in your field are going to affect the environment, right? You want to know, should there be a leak? Should there be some damage or one or other damage whatsoever to the environment? What will the implications be? So at that point, I think the role of an environmental engineer would be very, very useful. It will also be useful during the commissioning, right? So when you're shutting off operations, to make sure that the way you're leaving the environment is sustainable, right? So you want to make sure that there hasn't been any damage that was performed during development, and that everything will be properly rehabilitated. Sorry. So I think at that point in the role of the environmental engineer will be very useful to make sure that everything is left in a good way when oil and gas companies leave an area.
So, thank you. We have another question related to environment and safety from Ndivhuwo. Ndivhuwo wants to know in the stages exploration, appraisal, development, production, and abandonment, where there are many risks to workers and to the environment.
So the question is, at which stage of the life cycle is the biggest risk to the environment?
Yes, and the workers.
And the geology.
And the workers.
And the workers. Okay, thank you. So personally, where I think there would be the biggest risk to the environment would be when you begin to drill, right? Because if not done correctly, you could have fluids. If your well is not controlled properly, you could have fluids flowing out of control, right? So when you drill, you want to make sure that your well bore is well contained and that you don't have any blowouts, right? So this happens in the development phase, right? So blowouts basically is oil and gas spilling out into the environment because there's just too much pressure, right? So that of course will affect workers because, I mean, if the hydrocarbons have toxic gases such as hydrogen sulfate, they'll inhale that, right? And that will be detrimental to their health. And if the hydrocarbons flow, for example, into the ocean, then it's going to be detrimental to marine life, to fish, right? And to marine plants as well. So another point where there could be detrimental effects is during production, right? Because in some cases, gas is usually flared, right? So if you have a oil reservoir and you're producing both oil and gas, but you don't want to use the gas, what happens is the gas will be burnt out. I don't know if you've seen pictures of oil rigs where they have a fire coming out. So that's basically gas being burnt. And that's of course not good for the environment, right? Because you're sending out greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So those for me are the areas where I do potentially see the biggest danger and risk to the environment and workers as well.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And I think some people can watch the movie Deepwater Horizon, and it shows a little bit of the drilling operations and what can happen if you have a safety or environmental problem in your drilling rig. I have asked some questions on my LinkedIn page, so to all that.
Oh, the question is reservoir engineering different for oil versus gas fields?
Yes.
I mean, it is different. So the performance of the reservoir and the concepts will be different. I mean, the application is the same, but how you apply it will be different because what we're working with is different gases, I mean, different fluids. So for example, the way to best produce an oil will be different to producing a gas, right? So for example, if you want to maximize recovery, right, in an oil reservoir, what you may need to do is inject water or gas, or else that is not something you do for a gas reservoir, right? So the way you produce it is different, and the way you design your surface facilities as well is different, right? Because they have, I mean, your fluids have different properties, right? So for example, gas is very big, right? And the way it's stored is different from, gas can be very big and it may need to be compressed because it occupies too much space. So the way you handle that may be different to the way you handle the storage and transportation of oil, right? So another thing is that gas and oil reservoirs will have different challenges at the end of the day. So you need to be able to understand the behavior of either fluid in a reservoir environment.
Thank you, Ndivhuwo. I have one more question, and the question is: do you think that joining a professional organization, in your case, I think it's the Society of Petroleum Engineers, makes a difference? And do you think that women can benefit more from being member of such organizations?
Oh, yes, definitely. So I'm actually glad you're asking about the SPE because, I mean, it's one of the biggest organizations that we have for professionals which work in oil and gas. So the SPE has a lot of members, right? So that means that you're able to network with different people from all over the world because, I mean, it's established globally, right? We have people coming from South Africa, you have people coming from Mozambique. So you're able to network and learn from everybody's experiences. So not only that, but the SPE is also serious or is mandated, of course, to share technical expertise, right? So as part of the SPE, you have access to technical papers, you have access to technical presentations, you're able to attend technical talks. We have different professionals coming in from all over the world, you know, teaching and sharing knowledge from different areas. So I think it's very good, like for one to join professionals, to join professional organizations, right? Because I mean, you learn and you help grow your community, and you also learn about the different opportunities that are available for you in the oiling sector, right? Which will help you get employed if you're looking for a job, which will help you increase your expertise if that is what you're looking to do. So definitely 100%, I think joining such organizations is good for your professional development and your career.
Thank you for your answer. I think I'm looking forward to joining professional organizations. Do you enjoy being an engineer?
Yes, definitely, 100%. I do enjoy being an engineer. I knew when I was young that I wanted to do something in engineering because I'm very curious, okay, first of all. I like finding out about how things work, and I also like applying my creativity as well, to solutions, right, to solving problems. And what makes me also happy is seeing what my contribution is doing to society at the end of the day, right? I mean, I'm involved in, I'm part of the oil and gas energy sector. And although I don't do much, I know that the little bit that I do somehow contributes to the energy sector, right? It contributes to Africans having access to fuel, having access to energy. I mean, we have lights on, we have our cars moving around with fuel. I mean, we have products that we use that are coming from crude oil, for example. And I know that somehow I'm part of the story. So seeing all these differences, seeing all this happen in the world makes me proud, right? Because it means that what I do and what I'm passionate about is indeed making a difference. So I do enjoy being an engineer.
Thank you. That's great. We have last, I believe that would be the last question, and that's from Nemakonde. She says she's willing to get more information and questions, and how do we reach out to Ndivhuwo for further questions and information? That was the question.
Oh, thank you very much. I am available on LinkedIn. I think my name was tagged on the advert, on the promo for this talk. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on there, or you can also get my details from the MWE organizers, and they'll help you be able to get a hold of me. So I'm available to anybody who's interested in knowing more. If you want any advice on what's happening in the industry, if you need any information, I'm always available to help anybody who's interested. So yeah, you can reach out to me via LinkedIn, or you can reach out to the talk organizer, to the NWE administrators, and they'll be able to connect you with me.
Thank you for being available to answer further questions. I believe that many will come, maybe not now, maybe in a few days. Thank you, Ndivhuwo. That was the last question. I believe that we have done our best today, and I would like to say thank you to you and to everybody who have joined. I will pass on to Nancy so we can conclude this episode. Thank you.
Thank you, Sian. Thank you, Ndivhuwo, for this presentation, for this section. I hope all of you guys had the chance to learn a lot about reservoir engineer, reservoir characterization, how to be a really good engineer in this field. And I want to remember all of you that we will launch the 3rd episode, and all of you will be informed when the episode will come. And please follow us on our LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube page to stay connected. Thank you so much for this time. See you all soon.